We're back with another edition of the Federalist Radio Hour. I'm Emily Jashinsky, culture editor here at The Federalist. As always, you can email the show at radio@thefederalist.com. Follow us on Twitter at FDRLST, and make sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel. Today, I'm joined by Christian Datoc. Christian is the White House correspondent for The Daily Caller. You can follow him on Twitter at Talk Radio. He spells talk T-O-C. It's a little bit of a play on his name.
It might be a pun in some circles. I don't know.
Yeah,
I didn't graduate from high school. I'm just kidding.
That's not true. Datoc, welcome to the program.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
So is this is your first time on Federalist Radio Hour?
It is, yes.
So why don't you give us a little bit of background on how you ended up as the White House correspondent at The Caller?
Wow, I was not expecting this question. I don't know if we have enough time to get into it entirely, but like many a poor struggling journalist, I found myself getting into media immediately after working on Capitol Hill.
Yes.
I guess not immediately. I took a brief stint to bartend full-time. Shout out Chris Bedford. But
senior editor / Federalist bartender.
Yes,
Bedford,
indeed. Yeah. But I worked at the Daily Caller for a while. I left, and Emily and I actually worked together at the Washington Examiner for a brief time. I am now back at the Daily Caller. I started doing work on our paywalled video products, and I wrote a little bit on the side. But about a year ago, they decided they want me on the White House beat. So this is how I ended up here. It was really horrible timing because I took over full-time in February. So I don't know if you guys realize this, but that was right before this little thing called coronavirus happened. And it's been weird, to say the least.
Let's actually talk about that, because he said weird timing, but it's actually, I think, great timing for a lot of White House correspondents, because this White House in March, in April, and May, and honestly June, was extremely active in terms of having the daily coronavirus task force briefings.
Right.
Talk to us a little bit about your experience with those, your experience in the briefing room as Kayleigh McEnany took over the podium. What's it been like?
So I will say it was new for me. It was also probably new for a lot of other people in that room, because you guys remember Stephanie Grisham hadn't had a press briefing her entire tenure as press secretary. So when Kayleigh came in, that new regime started, I want to say in May. Maybe it was in March. It's all fuzzy at this point. What is time at this point? I can't really answer that.
It's a flat circle.
But it was nice that, well, okay, I want to hedge this. I'm not a fan of coronavirus. I'm not endorsing coronavirus at all. But one thing that made my job easier is that it thinned out the press corps a little bit in terms of who could be in the room.
Are you saying it thins the herd?
I am not saying it thinned the herd. I am saying it thinned the number of journalists trying to ask questions in the room.
Yes.
And so that made it easier for me as someone who was new to come in and make my voice be heard and sort of build a rapport with the press team and build my sources, because there were just flat out simply fewer journalists there vying for their time every day. So that was nice. That being said, again, with everything involving the pandemic and just, the extra responsibilities all of the administration officials had to deal with, it was strange. And I would have to imagine I'm going to be going through that same thing again, in the Biden administration in a couple of weeks. But it's certainly memorable, and, I don't think I made proper use of my time. I haven't reached out to anybody about writing a book, but I'm sure there will be annals written about covering not only the Trump administration, but covering it during the coronavirus pandemic itself.
Yeah, and what's it like now? Because I think a lot of people saw those glimpses at the briefing room in the early days of the summer and the early days of the pandemic, and people were pretty glued to those briefings, and they were really interesting. But now, post-election, there's been a briefing.
Yeah, there was one actually yesterday that I was at. There haven't been nearly as many since the election, and even before that, as the coronavirus was sort of sweeping through the administration, they had slowed them down quite a bit. But I don't think people are necessarily tuning in the same way for a number of reasons. First of all, obviously, the mainstream media is ready to move on to Joe Biden, and so they don't necessarily care about what Kayleigh or President Trump or whoever might be up there is saying on a day-to-day basis. Sure, they'll cut in to get the soundbite about what's happening with the coronavirus vaccine, but there's certainly not like wall-to-wall coverage like there was, back in July or back even in March when this thing started. That being said, I think there is still a very significant segment of the population, and not just, in the media, but people who either support the president or are extremely worried about what's happening with the pandemic that are tuning into these daily. And this sounds weird. It sounds like we're removed, but like it's one of my favorite things to do is to get in there because I look at this sort of differently. I think a lot of people approach the briefing room as like sort of, this is how I get famous, this is how I get on TV. But like the reason I'm in media is because I care about very specific policy issues. And like if everyone's going to ask the same question every single day, that makes, plenty of space for me to ask about what's happening with the China tariffs or like what's happening with immigration, or are we actually going to be pulling troops out of Afghanistan and Iraq and Somalia. So I look forward to those. I don't know if everyone around the country does as much as I do, but it's literally like my favorite part of my day is going into the briefing room and asking questions in like a place that has, tons and tons of history. It's the gravity gets lost on us living in DC, but it's cool being in that situation, to say the least.
And it's a really tiny room. It looks much bigger on TV.
It does, yeah. I mean, we're very cramped, and I said this before. Coronavirus thinned the herd. That you said that. I'm not saying that.
I'm pretty sure you said it.
I said it this time. It thinned out who was in the briefing room, but like you're literally sitting shoulder to shoulder. I mean, the desks are as close as we are right now, and it's with people who you don't know if what they were doing, what they were around, and I feel like a little bit of the coronavirus paranoia is perhaps rubbed off on me just being around these people in there. But it's certainly small quarters, and if it rains, the basement definitely floods. And in the summertime, it's like 5,000 degrees in there.
It's old.
It's suboptimal, to say the least.
Yeah.
But I love it.
Is there... I just, it's so important to love what you do.
Totally.
You'll never work a day in your life.
Those are your words.
No, so is there tension between you and the members of the sort of like corporate media and the press corps? Like, do you feel like they're throwing shade on you ever when you're in the basement?
Personally, I don't think so, and maybe it's just because I have like a jolly disposition. Yeah. But one thing that I tried to do when I took this job is, be a people person, and this is sort of what my skill set lends to this position. One of the reasons why they wanted me, they being my editors and my publisher, in this role is because I like talking to people. I like, just conversing. I think I'm pretty good at developing a strong relationship with most people, or at least a workable relationship. So, I made it my business to like make Jim Acosta and like Peter Alexander, Paula Reed, these people at least recognize that, okay, like I'm not here to play games. I'm here to like do my job. Like no matter what you think about the Daily Caller, you have to think about this. I mean,
I'm kidding. No, it's not.
Spot the lie. But, they're going to look at me in a way that I can control because I'm going to operate and conduct myself in a specific manner. And, like, I don't think necessarily that they all are all like, oh, the Daily Caller is amazing now. But, I think I get as much help out of the network correspondents as anyone at the Daily Caller because, one, I show up, I volunteer to help on pool duty, and like they can see that I'm in there. I'm asking real policy questions. I'm not in there to start fights with anybody or anything like that.
Or to ask some of those like T-ball questions where someone will just sort of like tee Trump up and let him rip. Yeah.
I mean, he's going to talk about what he wants no matter what. I don't think you really need to give him an opportunity to, drop the hammer on Joe Biden or Hunter Biden or anything like that. He's going to get there eventually. You might as well ask about the specific policy you want to ask about.
Mr. President, this election was fraud.
I'm very glad you brought that up, Emily.
This is the best question I've ever gotten.
Totally rigged.
Okay, so how does your approach differ when you're asking questions to Trump versus to Kayleigh? What's the best way to get a good answer out of either of them?
That's a good question. Did you tailor that directly to me to get a good answer out of me?
Honestly, I'm sort of flying by the seam of my pants here. I have no idea what's happening.
That's how I live my life every day. I'd like to say that you don't, but deep down, everyone knows that that's just not true. I mean, I think it's easier to ask questions of Kayleigh simply because she's not the president of the United States. And like, again, I would like to say that... Yet, that's a very good point. I would like to say that you don't get intimidated of the office, but you definitely do. And, I've interviewed the president. I've sat down in the Oval Office, looked across the Resolute desk, at him as he's been brought a Diet Coke.
Peered into his soul.
Yeah, and practiced for like weeks on what my questions were going to be. I had my whole notepad with me. I felt very prepared. And then the first question gets, it's time to ask that. And I'm like, blah. So just on that alone, I would say you got to sort of steel yourself up to ask questions of Trump. But I mean, I think you and I have been in this business a lot. You understand you don't need to be super formal. You can, at least in my view, the best way to do this is to be conversational. And so I really don't think you should be approaching any of these interviews or any of these press conferences differently depending on who the principal is up there.
Okay. All right. Fair enough.
Was that the answer
Fair
you
enough.
thought I was going to get?
That was too responsible of an answer.
Wow. Well, that's certainly one thing I'm known for, is being too responsible.
Too responsible. So Christian has been doing a lot of reporting this year on Hunter Biden, actually. And so I want to ask you, looking ahead to the Biden White House, which I assume you're still going to cover the Biden White House.
That's correct, yeah.
Okay. So have there already, this is kind of a leading question, have there already been signs that the Biden White House is going to be less accessible to the press than the Trump White House? And that's, I will preface that question by saying, the Trump White House, for all of Trump's anti-media rhetoric, it's pretty clear that he's run one of the most accessible White Houses in terms of media access ever. Because he loves media, and there are a lot of these people in the White House and in Trump circles love talking to the media because they're used to tough questions. So it's like, what are you going to do to them?
Right.
They get everything, so you're not going to trip them up. So that being said, what are the early indications of how the Biden White House will run its press operation?
I mean, I think you're right. It definitely will be different than the way Trump has operated. It's going to be a lot more like the Obama administration. It's going to be like the Bush administration. It's traditional, and the White House is going to let out what they want to let out. There's not going to be as many junior level anonymous sources leaking to the press. But at the same time, I mean, and this is not, well, I guess it is sort of meant to be a knock on the Trump administration. Behind the scenes, at the policy level, they were very understaffed for 4 years. And I didn't even necessarily know this until I got into the White House. So just getting the details on what a specific policy objective was difficult because they shifted on the fly, in large part, because they weren't fully staffed up, but also because, the Domestic Policy Council could come up with this great plan for healthcare, just as a random example, and they could be bringing it through to the finish line. And all of a sudden, the president starts tweeting stuff that wasn't in that brief. And it's like, well, are we going to say the president of the United States is wrong, or are we going to adjust our plan?
Sure. So
that will certainly be different because I expect the Biden administration to be a lot more on message as a whole. Mm-hmm. And I also think we're going to be seeing a lot less of Joe Biden at press conferences. I would hope that, Jen Psaki has as many press briefings as we've had over the last, I guess 10 months at this point.
Yeah.
Throughout the pandemic. I would expect that to continue as long as coronavirus is a thing. But once that's done, I hope they don't close the spigot off because the flow of information is important, especially as, I wouldn't necessarily say I'm super, right wing or I'm like a huge opponent of Joe Biden, but like as someone who works at a conservative news outlet, it's important that in a Democratic administration, we have access to these people and, we need to ask them questions because ultimately Joe Biden is an elected official and he should be accountable to the people who put him in office.
When you're the only, the conservative media are the only people who are going to ask particular questions.
Exactly.
And that's, there are blind spots beyond just media bias. It's also like a cultural bias, like not understanding, that you need to ask questions about the opioid crisis or about X, Y, and Z. So that's, before I get into Hunter, because I want to talk about that, and you've done some excellent reporting on it, one more question on this. There's going to be a lot of hand-wringing and reckoning after Trump leaves office about what traditions, some of these conventions that he broke, and the daily press briefings are going to be a huge part of that conversation.
Yeah.
And that's, I'm curious for your opinion as to whether the what's the word I'm looking for? The kind of phasing out of the daily press briefings, which the White House press corps sort of breathlessly extolled as an essential American institution, even though they're not that old. Do you think that's ultimately? Do you think Biden will return to daily briefings with Jen Psaki? I kind of think no. I kind of think they'll be a few times a week. But because I think we've proved with Trump that that's probably fine. That's, in the era of social media when accessibility and, messaging is so easy on both sides from the press and from the White House, it's just, it does seem like it's unnecessary to get up there every single day. Do you think that would ultimately be good or bad? And what do you think they're going to do with the briefings?
I think you're right. I think they will sort of scale them down. I want them to happen as much as possible because A, that lets me get in the room to ask the questions, and B, it lets me show my bosses that I'm doing my job.
I put on a jacket today.
Yeah, exactly. You see this? I got a tie bar on. Not today. But
shut up, Jeff.
I think it will be fine ultimately. I mean, again, I think if we look back to when they moved the press briefings to every single day, it was about a month and a half after Mike Pence was named the task force head.
Right.
And people were really mad about what the administration was doing in terms of their response, and they wanted someone up there to answer questions on who was making these decisions, how are the medical experts interpreting the data, because we didn't really necessarily have that. We had Mike Pence going up there like 2 or 3 times a week, and for all of Mike Pence's faults, he's very good at like easing people's concerns and just being like the calm, like soothing voice. That wasn't necessarily what people needed, and so it was good to get Trump and Fauci and Dr. Birx up there and, saying exactly what they did that day and then taking questions from the press. Eventually that turned into the press just repeating the same line over and over and over again. Mm-hmm. So in that way, it wasn't super fruitful. But I think ultimately we'll be fine if these get pulled away, we being the collective American public, less so than the press corps. Because again, a lot of these were treated as sort of theater by, the television stations. And it's not just, CNN. It was Fox News doing the same thing. And all of the smaller outlets, the correspondents want to get screen time. You want to be known. You want to be recognized and, so you can leverage your salary into something higher than it currently is.
A book deal.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So I hope, I guess, circling back, that was sort of all over the place. I hope they don't roll them back entirely. But even if they limit them compared to what the press briefings are currently, what their current occurrence is, I think the country will be fine. Because again, like we look back at the Obama administration, we look back at, the Bush administration, we weren't doing daily press briefings. If anything, we were doing like monthly press briefings. Mm-hmm. Certainly, the Defense Department had theirs and, the State Department had theirs, but the White House press secretary wasn't up on national television every single day answering questions from reporters.
When we look back on the Trump administration, like you said, time has no meaning anymore, but it's kind of amazing to think that, only 4 years ago we were heading into the era of the Trump presidency when it was very new and there was the Spicer circus every day. Yeah. The media would come in and just go nuts and Spicer would punch him back. And it was just this like daily circus for months. And that's such an interesting moment in the Trump presidency that has felt like it's lasted a decade. But it was, it felt like we were in for that every day for 4 years. Yeah,
I mean, and you got to, again, think about what Trump's sort of his background is, even more so than his role as a businessman at the Trump organization. What did America know him as? They knew him as the guy from The Apprentice, right? Mm-hmm. He's a TV entertainment showbiz guy, and that's what he made, his presidency be shaped around. That's how he became famous, not only in politics, but like amongst the public as a whole. And so naturally, he wanted to have the same sort of spectacle. And I think it also seems like that lasted for so long is because we've had so many press secretaries, right?
Yeah.
People forget about, well, maybe you don't forget about it. I forget about him. Anthony Scaramucci, those tremendous 10 days. Again, Sarah Sanders was like there for a year and a half. Stephanie Grisham was a black hole for a little while. And that was very bizarre in terms of the rest of the Trump, at least press teams, their daily appearances during the administration. And then we've had Kayleigh for nearly the last year at this point.
Yeah.
So it seems longer than it really has, but I think it's going to people are going to look back, whether you liked Trump's policies or not, and be like, I kind of missed having those people up there all the time, even if you're not a super political person, because it's just like, there's a face to the name, and even if you hate this administration, you can see what they're saying every single day and be like, oh, that's right, I remember I hate these people.
Right. There's a huge difference between a written statement that you see in a tweet than somebody actually reading it, because, I mean, obviously it sounds stupid, but, you can see their demeanor, and then you can see how they, even if they're giving their canned scripted answer, you can see how they react to different questions. Yeah, that's an interesting point. So segueing into the Hunter stuff that I've teased now for 10 minutes. So Datoc has been doing a lot of really great reporting on this, and I'm curious, as somebody who's in the position of covering the Biden White House, who has done a lot of reporting on Hunter. Our friend Sagar, we've talked about this with him. It's that a lot of the allegations about Hunter, the China stuff is actually more, in my mind, more important than the Ukraine stuff.
Yeah.
And the China stuff is not going away. This is going to be, I expect that China in general is going to be a huge thorn in the Biden White House's side politically, let alone in terms of like the actual policy consequences of their relationship. But how do you see that story evolving over the course of the Biden presidency? What are some things that you're going to be looking for based on what you've reported on already?
Well, I think one of the things that I'm going to be looking at in particular is how Tony Blinken, Biden's nominee to be the next Secretary of State, how he sort of takes over the mantle from Mike Pompeo. Because again, we've touched on this a little bit. Well, not really, but we've sort of gotten around it. Whether you like Trump or not, he 100% fundamentally reshaped how people think about our relationship with China, right? For the better, I would argue, especially in the light of coronavirus and how we need to regain control of supply chains, yada yada yada. I don't need to go down the list for you guys. I would make sure, at least in my capacity in terms of holding the administration accountable, that they are making good on those promises, on putting American workers first, on making sure that companies invest in the U.S., because Joe Biden himself, his plan that was released by the campaign, basically did exactly what the Trump administration is doing. And then you look at what Joe Biden told the New York Times earlier this week about how he doesn't want to roll back the tariffs. He doesn't want to rewrite the Phase 1 trade deal, which I would actually argue is probably not as big of an accomplishment for the Trump administration as they're making it out to be. But it looks like these policies are going to be advanced through the next administration. And hopefully, Biden listens to people like Josh Hawley in the Senate, Ro Khanna over in the House. This is a bipartisan issue about advancing these policies and making sure we're putting American workers, American companies first, rather than just trying to offshore jobs and help corporations save, I'd say a few dollars, but a few $1 billion by, utilizing slave labor over in the Uyghur concentration camps.
Yeah. Well, and again, time is flat. This is a recurring theme of this particular podcast.
Totally.
But just a couple of months ago, actually, when the server story was breaking, something I think is important in terms of anticipating Biden's policy and his administration's policy towards China is that he took Hunter on Air Force Two to China. I think it was literally to Beijing, and Hunter conducted business with a company on that trip, and it's just impossible to imagine that Joe Biden had no idea that Hunter was tagging along on that trip on Air Force Two to make a deal with some Chinese businessmen. What is the ongoing relevance of Hunter's entanglements? Because I think it actually signals that, to me, that signals that Biden doesn't necessarily have this like strong moral disgust for China and the CCP, because if you did, and this isn't to excuse any business that Donald Trump himself has done in China, but if you did, you wouldn't be touching some of these companies that Hunter Biden was making deals with, and you certainly wouldn't be facilitating it, even if it's sort of like, if you're facilitating it indirectly by bringing him on Air Force Two. I don't think Joe Biden has that like moral disgust for China that we really need in a leader right now.
Yeah, I don't think he necessarily in the past has had it either. But I mean, again, before Trump came in office, none of our politicians really did, right? So I don't think these questions about Hunter Biden and, potentially Joe Biden's business ties to these Chinese oligarchs will go away anytime soon. But the way that, at least, if I were giving him advice, the way you can mitigate these is by practicing what you preach and say, okay, yeah, we all know what politicians, the handouts they gave to corporate America in the past. We're not doing that anymore. And just by making sure you instill these new policy lines and you are consistent, that's the way that you address it. Because let's be honest, it wasn't just Joe Biden. I mean, the Bush family has made money in China, not necessarily, setting up actual business dealings, but going over there and by speaking. Ronald Reagan did the same thing. I actually had a whole list of questions for when I interviewed, or not questions, but statistics for when I interviewed Rudy Giuliani of all these presidents who've gone over to China and who've gone to Russia and other, less than savory countries, we'll just say, and, have made money there after leaving office. Like, that's not unique to Joe Biden. But the way that he moves forward from that is just by being totally transparent. And I think he did a poor job of that in terms of trying to defend himself when all the Hunter Biden stuff was breaking. We say this in hindsight, but it was so obvious to me. They could have just gotten ahead of it and been like, yeah, like my son Hunter took advantage of his position and like he's had problems with drugs and alcohol or whatever. But like, wouldn't it be dumb of him to try and not leverage our family name to make money? That being said, I'm not condoning it now, and like we don't do that anymore. And there was nothing necessarily uncouth. We weren't taking bribes at the State Department when I was the vice president. But like, I just think total transparency is the way to solve this problem, because that's ultimately
it worked for Trump in a lot of cases. That's exactly how he like wriggled out of many controversies that sort of like cropped up. He would just be like, yeah, absolutely, it would have been stupid not to do that. Or
right.
Like
Especially the way the conversation has shifted, at least in the last 5 years on these these issues of foreign entanglements. I mean, if you're pretending that, this is the last thing I'll say on this, but if you're pretending that most politicians weren't making money overseas after leaving office, and then you're just got your head in the sand.
Yeah, but I think part of that is what I think there was like a realization of this when Trump's candidacy, the ascension of Trump and the ascension of Bernie Sanders, like it actually woke a lot of people up to the fact that our elites are totally selling out.
Yep.
And it's one of those things that's just like, but that is actually a really good point, that I think there are so many lessons that politicians could take from Donald Trump that they probably won't, which is that like authenticity. Mitt Romney is not rolling up your damn sleeves and pretending that you like peanut butter and marshmallow sandwiches or whatever that he said.
Side note, ew.
Yeah,
pass.
Ew. Secondly, like I'm sure he does like those sandwiches, but like that's not like that. If you were authentic, Mitt Romney, you would have given 60 Minutes a tour of your freaking car elevator.
Yep.
Like that would have been authentic.
Like, yeah, look at me. I'm a baller. I got this huge ass house. Like, what are you gonna do? Am I allowed to say that?
Yeah, of
course.
Bleep
that out?
Oh no, you can say huge ass.
Oh yeah.
But that's like, these are some of the lessons that people should learn from Donald Trump, that some of them maybe will. I mean, what do you think?
I mean, I think you're right. I think politicians as a whole, you should look at everyone who's coming to office and glean lessons from that. And again, say what you want, Trump certainly was like the imperfect vessel for taking on corporate America and taking on like the political elites, but he at least got people thinking about it, much like you pointed out, in the same way that Bernie Sanders did. And they're like, in many ways, polar opposite figures, but in a lot of other ways, very similar in their messaging. I mean, obviously both of them are like basically pure populists, at least on the RD spectrum these days. And, Trump actually had a lot of progressive solutions to policy issues that Republicans talked about all the time. Like how many politicians have successfully negotiated peace deals in the Middle East over the last, 50 years?
No, absolutely.
I can think of one, right?
Absolutely.
Well, actually, that's not true. I guess Bill Clinton also. But how did he do it? He approached it from a business standpoint. He didn't do the same thing we did all the time, which is like, well, we need to either annex Palestine or we need to make them a free state. He was like, no, we're going to have you guys invest in each other, and we're probably going to sell you the F-35 also. But like he took it from a different standpoint. And I think politicians moving forward would be smart to understand why, or not understand necessarily, but try and figure out why Trump was popular.
Yep.
And then take that and make it their own. Because Trump and Bernie certainly showed there is a real undercurrent in this country of people who are very dissatisfied, not only with the political elites, but with, you know, the economic elites. And if they don't, you know, change how they're messaging and change how they're crafting policy, those folks are going to be out of jobs. Because, I mean, we just look at what's happened this past summer in terms of protests on every issue.
Yeah.
I mean, we're not at like a very stable place socially as a country right now. And like, I hate to say, you know, there's a revolution coming, but like, there's a revolution coming if these people don't change the way they're operating.
Hide your kids, hide your wives.
Oh man, your words again.
Well, this is, yes. And I am actually always sympathetic to the argument that there are certain norms, not all of the norms, of course not all of the norms. Some of the norms that Trump has shattered have been amazing. But like, I'm totally sympathetic to the argument that shattering all of these norms might have really bad effects when Trump is out of office and you have Democrats shattering the same norms. I don't necessarily think it's great, for instance, that people are going to be able to wiggle out of releasing their tax returns in the future. Like, future candidates are probably not going to have to do that. But then again, Donald Trump is completely singular. And so some of this chaos of the presidency is going to be, I think, super specific to the Trump era, not the social chaos. Certainly that is going nowhere. Antifa is going nowhere under Biden. But it's just funny to me that we have Joe Biden, this man who's promising to restore the soul of America. And I'm sure that resonates and that hits great with a lot of people. But at the same time, he's just the perfect epitome of what establishment politicians are. So
totally.
He can talk about the soul of America. He might believe in the soul of America, but he's also in it for money. And, you know, in some cases that's taken precedent over the country.
I don't disagree with that, but I mean, I almost think that's why we talked about, I keep saying the media has talked about how Trump was uniquely positioned to like take on these new challenges, right? I think, and this is maybe like 10D, big brain chess at this point. But like, given the fact that, you know, Joe Biden was the credit card senator from Delaware, right? Given that he is the epitome of like the corporate, you know, moderate Democrat politician, he could change that, right? Because if anyone's going to shift the way these people operate, it's the leader, right?
Yeah.
And so if Joe Biden is serious about fixing these problems and unifying the country, I think he's uniquely positioned to do that. Whether or not he will follow through on that is yet to be seen. I would hope, again, because, you know, I'm not in it for like the culture war. I don't want to like see Democrats. I know you are, but like ultimately, like, we care about the country and we care about, you know, people, and like it only helps people if both sides ultimately are working together. I would say.
Lame.
I'm wearing my blue shirt. What are you going to do?
So you mentioned Rudy earlier,
Yeah.
and as somebody who's interacted personally with Rudy in recent weeks, what is your impression of what's going on with America's mayor right now?
I think the New York Times was dead on when they reported, I want to say on Monday, that he's basically just doing this being the post-election legal theatrics because he wants a pardon. He wants a back pocket, get out of jail free card for any indictments that he might be facing down the line. I don't really know what happened with Rudy, because I guess let me backpedal a little bit. I think a lot of what he was saying about the Hunter Biden stuff, as verified by the Daily Caller after we reviewed the hard drive,
Right.
is there. There is there for sure. But like, he is a career prosecutor. He knows there's not direct evidence. There's no like bank transfers on this hard drive. Again, I know because we've gone through the hard drive after he handed it over to us, you know, saying Joe Biden got $10 million from this business deal. Mm-hmm. And so I don't know why he was framing it in this specific way, other than the fact that he thought it was going to win Donald Trump the election.
The big man, so they like
10 to the big guy, 10% of the big guy,
yeah, the
or whatever.
Big guy, like they latched onto that right away, and understandably so. Do you think that was a fair jump? Do you think it was a fair jump, or do you think they were over their skis in the weeks before the election, ready to?
I mean, I think they were over their skis. I guess I should back up. I interviewed Rudy on this twice up in New York. Once immediately after the New York Post first put these stories out there, and then another time about a month after that when he had handed over the hard drive to the Daily Caller after me basically badgering him, saying like, what the hell, dude, give us the hard drive so we can look over it and see if you're lying or not.
Yep.
And they finally did it. And, you know, I asked him this both times, like, obviously you're a partisan in this. You are the president's personal attorney.
Yep.
You're one of his day one supporters. You're one of the biggest names in American politics. You're not just like some objective person who stumbled upon this. Given that, and given the timing of this, and given the fact that it's been released piecemeal, this looks like a political hit job.
Yeah.
Will you admit to that? And he basically said, yeah, but like, wasn't the Russia investigation a political hit job? Wasn't, you know, the Steele dossier commissioned by the DNC and Hillary Clinton's campaign, like, wasn't that dirty politics? I'm like, yeah, but like, two wrongs don't make a right. Just because they did it doesn't mean what you're doing isn't the same thing. And he basically admitted to that. And like, I guess I sort of respect that in like a weird way. Like, he was sort of honest with me in that one moment on this. But like, ultimately, and this is what I was saying before, I don't think that the way the Hunter Biden story was covered by the media or the way it was pushed by the president's allies ultimately helps anyone, because maybe it moved the needle a little bit with the election, but like, this only ingrains in people's minds that the other side, whether you're on the right or the left, isn't playing fair.
Yeah.
And like, that's not going to bring us together as a country. And that's not going to like de-escalate the tensions between, you know, the two factions in America right now. And I wouldn't even call them Republican and Democrat, because they're not really anything like what those parties were when they were first formed, right?
It's like leftists and
yeah, it is.
Like Trump supporters,
Yeah.
basically. Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, I think the counter argument would be, you know, we will never come together as a country if Joe Biden is elected.
That's
like, I think
awfully
that's really how they
pessimistic.
see
Yeah,
it.
I think you're right. Yeah,
And
that's
I
fair.
understand that, actually. It's like the very popular Flight 93 calculus, which is that if Joe Biden is elected, or if Trump loses, whatever the situation is when you're making this calculus, then the country's past the tipping point. And so I think that's totally how they see it. And that's why when you press the mayor on, you know, isn't this two rights making a wrong, he cops to it, because I think that's actually at the heart of what they believe, is that this is the tipping point. That said, I don't want to put you on the spot here, but there's a lot of speculation about Rudy Giuliani being, you know, senile or just losing his marbles. As somebody who's been, you know, across a desk from him recently, what's he like? I mean, what's his demeanor like? What's it like to talk to him?
This is tough, and like, I don't want to like make it seem like he has full on dementia. I don't know, but you know, as people get older, you lose it a little bit, right? And like, sort of trying to cross-examine him, he's sharp. I mean, you can still see it. He's a
prosecutor.
Is there, yeah. Like, he's got the tools still, but I don't know if he's just bought in, and it's you know, we see this on both sides with people as they get older. You get more entrenched in the other side is evil, like they're destroying whatever I stood for, blah 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 blah. I think he's at that point, and it's sad to see, because I mean, I was pretty young on 9/11, but I remember seeing Rudy Giuliani right after that, and I was in his apartment. I was, you know, we did both of these interviews in his apartment. The walls are just papered with like photos of him with like the '99 Yankees and Joe Torre, and it's like, this is awesome. Like, I remember Rudy Giuliani, and like, you see him now, and he's very clearly not the same person. And so in that way, it's a little bit sad. I think to a certain extent, and you sort of hit it on it a second ago, this is revenge for him, because let's not forget, he was wrapped up in the Russia investigation. His business partners have been indicted on, you know, foreign lobbying charges. He's still a part of an open investigation on that himself. He thinks it's dirty politics the way they came after him. So he's just like, I don't really care if I go down with the ship. Like, I'm going to do it to them too. I think that's really what's driving him at this point. And again, the prospect that Trump could pardon him in the last month for anything that might be coming down the pipe when Joe Biden takes over.
Let's wrap on this question. What is one thing? Let's not say what is one thing, but in general, as a member of the White House press corps, how do you think the White House press corps could sort of restore its credibility or restore its effectiveness going forward? And obviously, we're in the context of a Democratic presidency,
right?
And it's going to be another. It's just going to be a constant it'll be two things, right? Like they will, on the one hand, pepper him with some of the laughable questions that President Obama got, and then on the other hand, they're going to be super eager to show that they still ask Democrats tough questions, and they're going to do some of that for sure, even if it's not balanced with how they would treat a Republican. But how do you think? In this context, how do you think the White House press corps could restore maybe its credibility with the American people? Trust in media I believe it is at an all-time low in certain polls. And I'm sure that's partially due to the performance of the White House press corps in some of these highly televised briefings. What do you think could help the Correspondents Association, the press pool be stronger?
I'm not sure what they can do to be stronger. I think in terms of restoring public trust, there's like three real things you can do. You just brought one up, and that's asking hard questions of the incoming administration. That's a no-brainer, right? That's what I'm going to be doing in the room. And that's what I would like to think I did of the Trump administration, too, even though the Daily Caller is conservative. I tried to push them on stuff that I thought they were, coming up short on. The next thing is, and this is difficult again because money is king and people forget. Well, I guess people don't forget, but this ultimately is a business, and people in the press briefing have their orders from producers or from whoever to get the specific soundbite. But you can't just keep asking the same question over and over and over again. I think what turns people off more than anything is when CNN and Fox and CBS, you go down the line, all ask Kayleigh some different iteration of, well, why is the White House even having Christmas parties this year? It's we do. We just heard that. We have limited time. Ask a question that people care about, right? So that's two. And then three actually has nothing to do with the briefing room so much more as it does, covering events around the country. And I think we in D.C. sort of get caught up. We talk about the Beltway bubble all the time. But most people around the country don't really live how we live.
No.
And so you have to be, I don't know if empathetic is the right word, but you can't
touch. Yeah,
you can't look down your nose all the time and tweet a photo of every single person you see who's not wearing, a mask. And I don't know how you do that without trying to without coming off as trying to, basically, stealing your culture or putting on a blue collar attitude without acting. But I think there's a very real divide between people in media and the people who consume their product. I don't know how to bridge that, but I mean, that's the real one in my mind, because I don't think just asking one tough question of Joe Biden is going to automatically make, someone who voted for Donald Trump be like, oh, you know what? CNN is legit. They're fine. I don't know if any of these things are going to fix that, but I think those are good places to start.
I actually was just going to say, I think your first answer is particularly a good place to start, because a lot of old media people lament the impact that, believe it or not, this sounds quaint, but that 24-hour news had on political coverage.
Yeah.
And particularly in these briefings, when you have, camera-ready cable news personalities asking soundbite questions. And we saw a ton of that over the course of this administration, but it's not unique to this administration at all. And we've seen, I think, that also happen in the age of social media to print reporters who get that clip for Twitter that can go mega viral and boost their profile, boost the perception of them with their bosses. And so it's not just the cable people anymore. It's really everybody is doing this.
Right.
So I think that's a really important point, that a departure from the soundbite questions, Mr. Trump, are you a white supremacist? Or do you think the Confederacy should have won, or whatever that
questions
insane
that can't even,
question was?
Well, I would say questions that can't even really be answered, but you could very easily answer both of those questions and just put this to bed. But stuff that, really impacts people. Like whether or not Trump was a white supremacist doesn't really impact people in their day-to-day lives as, you might have lost a job and don't know if you're going to be able to pay your rent or your mortgage because you can't go to work. And is the stimulus check coming? Like that is a lot more consequential than whether or not President Trump, what he thinks of the Black Lives Matter movement.
Well, and a lot of these questions are things that are obvious. He's answered them a million times, and they just ask it to get him on camera responding to them. Like the white supremacy question or the, were you pleased with the outcome of the Civil War question? Like these are things that everybody knows the answer to. And sometimes Trump is going to say something hilarious or horrifying or whatever.
Yeah.
But it's I actually really like that answer because I feel like the sound bite angle that so many people come into this with has been totally exacerbated by Twitter, which is the biggest problem in media in general. And yeah, that's a great answer.
Thanks, dude.
Well done.
Appreciate it.
Gold star for Christian Datoc. Well, you've been listening to another edition of the Federalist Radio Hour. I'm Emily Jashinsky, culture editor here at the Federalist, joined by Christian Datoc, White House correspondent for the Daily Caller. You can follow him on social media, Twitter and Instagram at Talk Radio, TOC Radio, because he thinks he's cool.
Ruthless.
We'll be back soon with more. Until then, be lovers of freedom and anxious for the fray.